In a peaceful African village surrounded by tall palm trees and dusty red roads, there lived a young woman named Amara. She was known across many villages for her beauty. Her skin shone like the morning sun, and people often said no bride had ever looked as radiant as she did. When the day of her wedding finally arrived, the entire village gathered to celebrate. Drums echoed through the night. Elders sat proudly watching, and women sang joyful songs as the bride danced in her colorful traditional attire. Her groom, Obina, stood proudly beside her, smiling as friends and family blessed their union. But as the celebration continued deep into the night, something strange happened. Amara quietly excused herself, saying she needed to change her clothes before the final wedding ritual. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Soon people began to whisper. The bride had not returned. Her bridesmaids searched the compound. Her family searched the house. The groom called her name again and again, but Amara was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle. No one had seen her leave. The joyful celebration quickly turned to fear. That night, the entire village searched the forest, the river banks, and every path leading out of the village. But what they would later discover about Amara's disappearance would shake the village forever. Because the truth behind the bride's disappearance was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The morning after. When dawn finally broke over Umweze village, its light felt different, pale, uncertain, like even the sun itself was afraid to shine too brightly. Cocks crowed in the distance, but nobody moved with the normal rhythm of morning life. Old women sat outside their huts with their arms folded across their chests, eyes red from crying or from sleeplessness. Nobody could tell which. Children peeked from doorways, sensing the heaviness in the air, knowing better than to ask too many questions. Obina had not slept. He sat at the entrance of the compound where his wedding had taken place just hours before, his white traditional attire now stained with red dust from crawling through the forest all night, calling Amara's name until his voice cracked and broke like old firewood. His best man, Chukwuemeka, sat beside him in silence. There was nothing to say. What words exist for a man whose bride disappears on his wedding night? Amara's mother, Mama Chidima, had to be restrained at 3 different points during the night. She had thrown herself into the forest twice, wailing so loudly that the sound carried across the river and woke people in the neighboring village of Oguta. The village women now surrounded her like a warm fence of bodies, holding her, rocking her, praying over her in hushed tones. The elders called an emergency meeting under the big Udala tree at the center of the village square. Chief Okafo, the oldest man in Umweze, sat on his carved wooden stool, his face like cracked dry earth. He had seen many things in his 81 years on this earth. Floods, famines, wars between neighboring clans, children swallowed by rivers, but a bride disappearing from her own wedding compound with no trace, no sound, no explanation. This was new. This made the hairs on his ancient arms stand up straight. Has anyone spoken to Dibianosu? One elder asked in a low, careful voice. The question landed on the gathering like a heavy stone dropped into still water. Ripples of discomfort spread through the seated men. Dibianosu was the village diviner, a man who lived at the edge of the forest where the footpath ended and the unknown began. People went to him in desperate times, but they did not speak of it openly. He was not evil, but he was not entirely of this world either. He existed in the uncomfortable space between what men could explain and what only the spirits understood. Send for him, Chief Okafo said quietly. Dibianosu arrived before anyone could send a messenger, which was itself unsettling. He walked into the village square already dressed in his ceremonial wrapper, the one with the red and black patterns that people said contained old warnings stitched into the fabric by hands that had been dead for generations. He carried his goat-skin bag over one shoulder, and around his neck hung small calabashes, animal teeth, and a single dried red feather from a bird nobody in the village had ever seen alive. He was not surprised. That was what frightened everyone most. He looked at the gathered elders with the calm, patient face of a man who had already known the storm was coming and had simply waited for the villagers to catch up. "Where is the groom?" he asked. Obinna was brought forward. He knelt before the old diviner partly out of respect, partly because his legs had simply stopped working properly from exhaustion and grief. Dibianosu looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the compound entrance. Then he turned slowly and looked toward the forest. That dense, breathing forest at the edge of Umueze that children were warned never to enter after dark. He clicked his tongue 3 times. "This is not a simple matter," he said. He opened his goatskin bag and brought out 16 cowrie shells, which he threw onto a flat piece of black cloth spread on the ground. He studied their pattern with narrowed eyes, tilting his head left, then right, the way a bird studies something it is not sure it recognizes. Then his face changed. Whatever he saw in those shells did something to him, shifted something deep behind his eyes. He sat back slowly, almost carefully, like a man who had just stepped close to the edge of a cliff without meaning to. "Who in this village," he began, his voice now stripped of all its professional calm, "has a covenant with Ogwoji?" Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Ogwoji was a name people whispered only in the dark, only behind closed doors, and even then with a hand covering their mouth. It was an ancient ritual pact, the kind of contract a desperate man or woman might make with dark forces in exchange for wealth, power, or protection. The payment for such a pact was always delayed. It was always collected at the worst possible moment, and it was always collected in the form of the thing you loved most. "Nobody answers," Dibianosu said. He looked directly at Obinna's family side of the gathering. But someone here knows exactly what I am talking about. It was Obinna's uncle who broke first. His name was Ezeogo, a big, wide man with a booming laugh who everyone in the village liked. He sold palm oil in 3 different markets, drove a very new pickup truck, and always had money in his pocket at a time when many men around him were struggling. People admired him. People celebrated him. Children in his family called him Big Uncle and ran to him at every gathering because his pockets always held groundnuts and wrapped toffee. Nobody had ever asked the obvious question. Why was Ezeogo so consistently prosperous when his own father had died a poor man, when his brothers worked twice as hard for half as much? When Dibianosu's eyes landed on Ezeogo and stayed there, unblinking, the big man's face went through several changes. First, confusion, then offense, then something that looked almost like a rehearsed denial trying to arrange itself on his features. But his body betrayed him. His hands began to shake. Not a small tremor, a violent, uncontrollable shaking, as if something cold had entered his fingers and would not leave. "Ezeogo," Chief Okafor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you know?" The big man opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and then, like a wall that has held water for too long and simply has no more strength left, he collapsed forward and began to sob. Great heaving, ugly sobs that stripped away every version of himself he had ever presented to the world. The story that fell out of him was one that he had carried alone for 11 years. 11 years ago, when Obinna was still a young man just starting out in life. Ezeogo's business had been failing badly. Debt collectors were visiting his compound. His wife had threatened to take the children and return to her family. He had driven one night to a junction far from Umoise, the kind of junction that is not on any map, the kind that appears at midnight when a desperate man drives without a destination and somehow arrives somewhere he did not intend. A man had been waiting there. Ezeogo could never properly describe what the man looked like. Whenever he tried, the description changed: tall, then short, old, then ageless, wearing a dark wrapper, speaking in a voice that seemed to come from slightly behind where he was standing. The agreement had been simple. Everything Ezeogo desired would be given to him: wealth, respect, long life. His family would never suffer again. The payment was this: on the night of the first wedding in his bloodline, after the pact was made, the bride would be taken. Not killed, taken, removed from this world and delivered to the other side of a threshold that no living person could cross back over. She would not suffer, the man at the junction had said. She would simply no longer be here. Ezeogo had told himself in the dark mathematics of a desperate mind that this was a vague, distant condition. He had no sons. His brothers had no sons getting married soon. It had felt theoretical, abstract, the way a man signs a financial document without reading the small print, trusting that the catastrophic clause buried at the bottom will never actually be triggered. Then his nephew Obinna had grown up, fallen in love with Amara, and announced his wedding. Ezeogo had spent the last 3 months unable to eat or sleep properly. He had gone back to the junction 4 times, trying to renegotiate, to cancel, to offer something else instead. But the junction was never there when he went looking for it in desperation. It only appeared when he had no plan and no power, which was never now. He had told himself maybe it would not happen. Maybe the stories were exaggerated. Maybe it was all just superstition dressed in dark clothes. But Amara was gone. And now he knelt in the village square, a destroyed man with every eye in Umoise, watching him fall apart. Obinna did not rush his uncle. He did not shout or attack him, which surprised everyone present. He sat very still while Ezeogo confessed, his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable. When the confession ended, he stood up slowly, turned to Dibian and asked in a voice that was steady and quiet in the way that only complete heartbreak can produce, "Is she alive?" Dibian considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "She is not dead," he said carefully. But she is no longer in the place where the living walk freely. Can she come back? Another long pause. There is a way, the diviner said, but it is not a journey for a fearful man. Whatever loves her must go to the edge and call her back before the third sunrise. After the third sunrise, the place where she is held will close permanently. She will be beyond reach. Everyone looked at Obinna. He was already standing up. Dibian prepared Obinna for 3 hours. He bathed him in water infused with bitter herbs and white chalk. He drew markings on his chest and on the soles of his feet, using a paste made from things that nobody watching could name. He gave him a small clay pot sealed with beeswax and told him to carry it against his skin at all times and under no circumstances open it. You will enter the forest at the point where the Iroko tree with the split trunk stands, the diviner instructed. Walk straight. Do not turn left or right, no matter what you hear. You will hear many things: voices, laughter, crying, someone you recognize calling your name from a direction that is not straight ahead. You must not turn. How will I know when I have reached the place where she is? Obina asked. You will feel the air change. It will become warm in a way that has nothing to do with fire. When you feel that warmth, call her name 7 times. Not 6, not 8, 7. And if she does not answer? Dibianwoso looked at him with old, honest eyes. Then you come back alone and you grieve properly and you leave. Obina nodded. He walked into the forest as night fell for the second time since his wedding. The village watched him disappear between the trees. Nobody slept. What followed in that forest, Obina would spend the rest of his life finding words for and never quite succeeding. The voices came almost immediately. A woman crying softly to his left, children laughing somewhere above him in the canopy,
Obina.
his own mother's
Obina,
voice,
wait.
exact, perfect, unmistakable,
please.
calling his name from behind him with an urgency that made his chest tighten like a fist. He walked straight. The ground beneath him changed texture without explanation, from hard, dry earth to something that felt faintly soft, almost yielding, like walking on something that was gently breathing. The trees thinned and then thickened again and then thinned again. Moonlight appeared and disappeared in rhythms that had nothing to do with clouds. And then the air changed. Warm, not like sunlight, not like fire, but like the warmth of a familiar hand pressed against your face in the dark. Gentle and overwhelming at the same time.
He stopped walking. He opened his mouth. Amara! The forest swallowed the sound. Amara! Nothing. Amara! A wind moved through the trees from no direction. Amara! Something shifted at the edge of what he could see. Not a movement exactly, more like a change in the quality of the darkness ahead. Amara! His voice cracked on the 5th call. His eyes burned. He pressed his fist to his chest where the clay pot rested against his skin, warm and steady like a second heartbeat. Amara! The shifting darkness ahead of him grew denser, then began to separate, the way smoke separates when you walk through it. Amara! 7. And then he saw her. She was standing about 30 paces ahead of him, still wearing her wedding attire, the brilliant orange and gold wrapper, the coral beads at her neck, the delicate pattern of white chalk on her hands that the women of her family had spent hours drawing that morning. She was looking at him with an expression that contained more emotions than a single human face should be able to hold. Relief and fear and something raw and searching, as if she was not entirely sure yet that he was real. Obina, she whispered. He walked toward her. He did not run. Some instinct told him that running was wrong here, that urgency expressed as speed could disturb something fragile in this space. He reached her. He took both her hands. They were cold, not frighteningly cold, but cool in the way that a person who has been sitting in a dark room emerges into mild warmth and hasn't yet adjusted. I am here, he said. I couldn't move, she told him, her voice shaking. I could see everything. I could see the compound. I could hear the drums stop. I tried to call out, but no sound came. I was simply elsewhere, standing here and unable to return. You can return now, he said. Come. He turned them both toward where he had come from. But behind them, in the direction Amara had been facing, the warm air suddenly shifted into something cooler and less welcoming. A pressure, low and deliberate, like a closing door pushing air outward before it shuts. Obina gripped her hand tighter. Don't look back, he said, whatever you do. Obina, don't look back. They walked. They emerged from the forest at the split iroko tree, as the sky ahead of them was just beginning to consider the idea of morning. That earliest hour when black becomes deep blue and the first birds make tentative, questioning sounds. Chukwemeka saw them first.
He had been sitting at the forest's edge through the night, refusing to move, refusing to sleep, watching the dark space between the trees the way a guard watches a gate. When two figures appeared in the dimness, he stood up so fast he knocked over the lantern at his feet. He opened his mouth to call out and nothing came, just a breath, sharp and voiceless. Then the lantern light found Amara's face. He turned toward the village and screamed Obina's name with everything in his lungs. What erupted in Umueze village in the minutes that followed had no adequate description in any language spoken there. Amara's mother covered the distance between the village square and the forest entrance in a time that defied her age and her arthritis and every law of tired bodies. She grabbed her daughter with a force that almost knocked them both down, and the sound that came out of her was not crying and not laughter, but something between the two that the human throat rarely produces, the sound of relief so complete it briefly resembled agony. Obina's family, the village women, the elders who had kept vigil, all of them poured toward the forest entrance in a wave of noise and light and reaching hands. Amara held on to her mother and held on to Obina and shook, as if her body needed several minutes to accept that it was back in the world where it belonged. When morning fully arrived, the village gathered once more under the Udala tree, but the mood was entirely different from the celebration of the night before. It was sober, purposeful, the kind of quiet that precedes something necessary and irreversible. Ezeogo knelt in the center of the gathering. There was no hiding now, no version of events that recast him as anything other than what he was, a man who had bargained with darkness using someone else's life as currency. The fact that he had not believed it would truly happen, the fact that he had spent years trying to undo it, the fact that he had cried like a broken man when it did, none of that changed the shape of what he had done. Chief Okafo pronounced judgment in the measured, weary voice of a man who has lived long enough to know that punishing a person does not repair the wound they caused. Ezeogo was banished from Umueze. He would leave before sunset. His compound would be sealed. His name would not be spoken during celebrations, and his children, who bore no guilt, would be cared for by the wider family as their own. He was given the opportunity to speak. He stood slowly. He looked at Obina. He looked at Amara. He looked at them for a long time with the particular devastation of someone who understands, too late, exactly how much they have cost the people who trusted them.
I don't ask for your forgiveness.
I do not ask for forgiveness, he said, his voice barely carrying to the edges of the gathering. I only ask that you believe me when I say that if I could carry this weight alone, if I could have offered myself instead of an innocent woman, I would have done it without hesitation. Nobody replied. He picked up his single bag of belongings and walked out of Umueze as the afternoon sun tilted toward the horizon. Nobody watched him go. The wedding of Obina and Amara was held again, not a recreation, but a renewal. 7 days after the night of the forest, when Amara had rested and eaten and slept and woken and slept again, when color had returned fully to her face and warmth to her hands, the village gathered once more. This time, there were no dark undercurrents moving beneath the celebration, no unpaid debts lurking in the shadows of the compound. Dibiawosu performed a thorough cleansing of the bloodline. 3 days of ritual and prayer and the burning of particular herbs that sent white smoke rising straight into the sky with no wind to bend it. The elders took this as the best possible sign. Amara danced again in her wedding attire, the same brilliant orange and gold, the same coral beads, the same chalk patterns on her hands, redrawn by the same women who had done them the first time, but she danced differently now. There was something in her movement that had not been there before,
a groundedness, a deliberate joy, the dancing of a woman who has stood somewhere cold and dark and come back, and who therefore knows with absolute certainty how precious the warmth is. Obinna watched her from across the compound with the expression of a man who has been to the edge of losing everything and returned, and who will spend every remaining year of his life understanding what that means. When the final ritual arrived and the elder poured palm wine and lifted it in blessing, he spoke words that Umueze would pass down through generations long after everyone present that night had returned to the ancestors. There is no darkness deep enough to extinguish a love that is willing to walk in after it. The drums played until morning. This time, nobody disappeared. Moral lesson. Never trade what belongs to others for what you desire for yourself. Izilgo's greed bought him 11 years of comfort, but cost an innocent woman her wedding night and merely her life. The darkest truth this story reveals is this: desperation without wisdom leads a man to make promises he cannot keep with things that are not his to give. And no matter how long you hide a secret sin, life will always find the perfect moment to expose it, usually at the worst possible time and always at someone else's expense. Choose integrity over shortcuts. The price of greed is never paid by the greedy alone.